Good evening. Haven't been up here to preach in a while. Feels kind of weird doing so. I feel like I'm out of practice, and so, I guess I'll have to get back into practice this year. Hymns are powerful things, aren't they? I don't know if you've noticed, if you've been here a few times for me preaching, you may have noticed that I like to quote from them occasionally. And I thought I'd do the same tonight. And I'll start out with a quotation from a hymn because I find hymns very powerful and very meaningful if they're used in the right context. This is a hymn I was taught when I was a child, and we wouldn't really call it a hymn because we wouldn't sing it in worship. But I don't know if you all know this one. I grew up singing it. It goes a little something like this, and I'm not going to sing it, I'm going to read the words. Jesus called them one by one: Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Next came Philip, Thomas too, Matthew, and Bartholomew. Second verse: James, the one they called the less, Simon, also Thaddeus, and the 12th apostle Judas made. Jesus was by him betrayed. The chorus is very simple. Yes, Jesus called them. Yes, Jesus called them. Yes, Jesus called them, and they all followed him. Heard that song before? We used to sing that at VBS growing up, and that's why I'm so familiar with it, and I can name all of the apostles. Do you think that at the point at which Jesus called these men, do you think that they knew that he was calling them to die? I don't think so. They're sitting on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, mending their nets and fixing their work equipment, ready to go out that day or the next day. And Jesus comes by and asks them to drop everything that they've got going and follow him. And to their credit, they do. Turn to Matthew 4 if you're not already. We'll be in verses 18 through 22, looking at this idea of discipleship and what is involved in it. Our yearly theme this year for 2024 is this idea of discipleship. And so I thought you had an introduction to the topic this morning. And I thought this evening we look at what Jesus has to say about it. Two very simple ideas that come straight from this text, from the very words of Jesus. The first real teaching of his ministry as he comes down to these men and he says, "Follow me, and I will change you." Matthew 4 and verse 18, as Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew, casting a net into the sea because they were fishermen. He said, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John, in the boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets. And he called them. And immediately, what did they do? They left the boat and their father, and they followed him. It's the same response. And here in this passage, you have two things that Jesus gives these people. He gives out a call and he gives out a promise, just like God has always done in the Bible. God says, "Follow me and I will bless you." God says, "Follow me, I will fight for you." God says, "Stay faithful and I will bring you into heaven." Jesus says, "Follow me, I will make you fishers of men." There are 2 points to the sermon, not 3. I'm breaking the rule, but they're taken straight from Jesus' words. And the first thing we have to think about in discipleship is your job, that is to follow. Discipleship is all about following. Discipleship, the first thing you have to get across, get into your minds as you think about this topic, is it's an idea of total obedience. There is no compromise. Discipleship is not about a contested leadership. Discipleship is about putting yourself under a master who is in charge. The word disciple, we often talk about it. The word disciple is a fancy word that just means student or follower or learner, some synonym of that. The idea being that there is one who is in charge, and it is not me, and it's not you either. We would call students in a schoolroom disciples of the teacher. The teacher is teaching, is leading, and the students are listening. And much is the same when we talk about the disciple of Christ. We are disciples who learn from a teacher. When you come to Christ, if you want to be a disciple, a follower of Christ, that inherently means that you are not in charge of what you do anymore. That means you're not dictating the path that your life is taking. That means you're not the one who gets to make the calls on how things go. You're not in charge. When you go to Christ, it's a confession that He is in charge, and now I am going to follow Him. There's a popular idea in our culture that Jesus is my co-pilot, and He's going to sit in the passenger seat, and maybe I'll call on Him when the things get tough. There's another song, Jesus Take the Wheel. It's not a hymn, so I'm not going to quote it, don't worry. But the idea of that song is I'm going to drive the car until something bad happens, until I mess it up so badly that I have to just give it up. And Jesus can take control and He'll correct everything, and then I'm going to drive again. That's not what discipleship is. You can't think of discipleship like that. Discipleship is not Jesus joining your car. Discipleship is you parking, getting out, and letting Jesus come and drive instead. Discipleship is Jesus's rule over you. Discipleship is the master taking you where you need to go. And it's not about you making those decisions, it's about you following Christ. A student does not get to set the rules for the class. A student adheres to the teacher's rubric. And only by passing what the teacher says will the student get through that class. What are you expecting out of following Jesus? When Jesus comes down the shoreline, He says, "Follow me." You don't get to tell Him what to do. But the comforting thing about this is that Jesus, when He comes down as a master, He's not just a demanding master telling you to give Him everything without doing it Himself first. Because as you notice, when you watch Jesus, you see a lot of this playing out in Jesus's life. Earlier today, I was preaching in Escalon a similar sermon to this morning. Class in Escalon was on Philippians 2 and the idea that Jesus, what did He do? He was in heaven, He was equal with God, and yet He set that aside and He came down to earth and He became a man and humbled Himself to the point of death, even death on a cross. Do you think He wanted to do that? No. And yet that was God's plan for Him. Jesus' life was not Him doing what He wanted to do, it was Him doing what God had in store for Him. Jesus' life was about following God entirely. And it didn't matter what He wanted, He set it aside so that He could be like God. If you ever wonder how to do this, if you ever wonder how to follow Jesus, just look at how Jesus follows God, because He's modeled it for you perfectly. You're not in charge. You listen to the leader. There's a reason that Christ is described as the head of the body, because He leads and we follow. His life was complete submission to the call of God, just like the Son is in complete submission to the Father. Students, when they're taught, they grow up and they hold the same opinions as their teachers. Children grow up to be like their parents. Christians grow up to be like Jesus. We follow Him in everything just as He follows God in everything. And only then can we consider ourselves disciples of Christ. How do we do that? Right? How do you practically go about this work of following Jesus? Look at Jesus' life. What did He do to follow God? You know what He did? And you know what I would suggest for you? I would suggest that that we all start considering what you put in your lives. What did Jesus do when He was feeling stressed, when He needed to pick His disciples in the first place? He went away to a mountain and He prayed for a while. He got up early. He would get up before anyone else was awake. He would go off to a separate place. He would spend time with God, making sure He had His connection with God right, and only then would He come back. And only then would He deal with other people and work with them. Jesus was very careful about the sources that He listened to. Jesus was very careful about hearing God first. And the question for you is, do you actually hear God when He's calling, or are we always busy listening to other things? It used to be when I would drive anywhere, a couple of years ago when I was a young man. When I drove anywhere, I would listen to music. And of course, I have the best music taste Don't ask anyone because they will disagree with me. I would listen to music in whatever car ride. 10 minutes, couple hours, that's all. I've stopped that. Because as nice as music is sometimes, what does it do? Does it really drive you any closer to God? Does it really drive you any more towards other people? Or is it just something to distract your mind so you don't have to think for a while? And so, even though I listen to music every now and then, I've quit because it doesn't draw me closer to God. I don't listen to politics anymore. Every now and then I check in on the news, see if there's anything relevant in the stories, figure out that it's a bunch of sorrowful stuff, and close it out again. I don't worry about that anymore. Why? Because it's not bringing me closer towards God. Why would I spend my time listening to that when I could instead listen to Jesus? None of these things are wrong, not inherently of themselves, but when they cut into your time of listening to God, they start to become a distraction. Jesus would clear his schedule. He would clear his mind. He would go towards God. He would meditate on him and pray with him and be there, get himself in the right mind, and then go to his work. What do you spend your time thinking about? What do you spend your time intaking? What do you spend your time putting in? Because what you put in determines what you get out. Worked with a church for a little bit. There was an elder there who has left an indelible impression upon me. He would work at multiple CVSs. He would manage a whole bunch of them, and he would have to drive multiple hours per day in this commute to reach all of these stores multiple different times because he had to settle every problem. And when he drove his hours of commutes, guess what he was listening to? He had a King James version of the Bible on CD that he just had on repeat. He wouldn't pay attention to it all the time. He wouldn't be cognizant with it all the time, but in the back of his mind, he was listening to the words of God. When I talked with him, I had dinner with him one time. He said, I look forward to the day that I can retire so that I can spend a bunch of hours reading God's word and not have to be worried about any of this other stuff. I can safely say I've never had that thought in my life. What does that say about me? Would I use my time to listen to the words of God? Jesus says, follow. There is no limit on that. You don't get to determine where that begins and ends. You follow and you listen to him. Consider those things that you're listening for. Focus your time on Jesus, and as you invest your time in him, you'll start to see some changes. His call is to follow, and as these men do, the promise is fulfilled. Namely, they start becoming those fishers of men. Your job, follow. Your goal is this. The end goal of being a Christian is to make other people Christians and to help drive people closer towards God. That's what being a fisher of men is about. Jesus takes their occupation. You're a fisherman, and he makes a little pun on it. Hey, now you're going to fish for something that's way more important. It's not just about fish anymore. It's not just about providing for yourselves and your families physically. It's about providing for yourselves and your families and everyone else spiritually. You're going to go out. You're going to reach people. You're going to bring them back in towards God. You are going to become the spiritual fishermen. And what he does in this is he replaces your useful your uselessness. He brings you into life and he gives you a total purpose. A lot of times we spend our time just fulfilling routines, don't we? Get up, you go to work, you eat food 2 or 3 times a day as per usual, you get back, you're done with work, you do whatever in your couple of afternoon hours, and then you go to bed. And you wake up the next day and you just repeat that cycle over and over. But Jesus is not about keeping that. Jesus is not about keeping the schedule and the life the way it always has been. Jesus is in the business of changing people. He doesn't come to make you Christian. He doesn't come to make you religious so that you sit back contented with where you're at and continue to live that same life. He lives to give you a purpose in life. He lives so that he came, so that he could take you from being a sinful person to remake you into the image of God so that you too can turn around and help other people to see God. God doesn't expect you to hear him and sit. He says follow. That requires you getting up and doing something about it. And God expects us to respond to him. It's about doing God's work. And it's always God doing the work, yes, but he always uses humans as his conduits. I'm reminded of Acts chapter 8, in which God wants to preach to the Ethiopian eunuch. And so he tells Philip, go preach to the Ethiopian eunuch. And the eunuch is saved. Why? Because Philip preached to him. Acts chapter 9, when God speaks to Ananias and says, Ananias, go and speak to Paul. God was talking with Paul earlier in the chapter, but salvation came when a man spoke to a man about God. Same in Acts 10. God sends an angel to Cornelius, not to preach Cornelius the gospel, but to tell Cornelius, go talk to another human being who's going to preach you the gospel. Why does God do that? I don't know. But he uses humans, those willing humans, those who are following him. He uses us to take the gospel towards other people. And it's always been that way. He doesn't speak from heaven to rain down information on the unbelievers. He tells Christians to take his word and go out and work with it. There's an expectation. If you are going to follow Jesus, you are going to work. And there are no two ways about that. Laziness and Christianity are incompatible, and you can't hold both. You can't hold to your comfort zone and also be a Christian. That's not how it works. You're going to follow Jesus, you're going to follow him, and you're going to change. I will make you into fishers of men. Jesus is effecting change in these people's lives. And we wonder, how do we do this? Right? How do I become a fisher of men? How do I reach out to people? How do I make that impact? You know how? You should watch Jesus. Because just as Jesus was the ultimate example of how to be a disciple, of how to be a follower, of how to follow the Lord, Jesus is the ultimate example of how to catch people, of how to reach out to the world, of how to make an impression, of how to save, of how to bring people into a relationship with God. When Jesus is sitting at a well in Samaria, in John chapter 4, a woman approaches, a Samaritan woman, and rather than doing the typical thing of that time in which you would just ignore that person, or maybe even step away from the well because you don't want to get contaminated with whatever it is that she's got, instead, Jesus addresses her. And he addresses her in this relevant way. He says, you're coming for water? How about I tell you about living water? You know what that's doing? It's throwing out a line. That's fishing and seeing if she will get engaged in a conversation. And it works. And she is presumably saved as well as the entire city. In John chapter 5, I believe, a paralytic is laying down by a pool. He's waiting for the waters to be stirred up so that he can be saved from his terrible situation. And what does Jesus do? He comes up to the man, and he doesn't just heal him. He says, do you want to get well? And that man engages the conversation, and through that is made whole again. Jesus' conversations are always about this, are always about laying down ideas. Ideas that if you will catch up on them, if you'll pick them up, you can run with it. That's how you catch people. Fishers of men, that's what Jesus is about. A life dedicated totally towards helping others reach God. He's always putting out ideas. He's always looking for people who will listen. He's always looking and hoping and praying that someone will pay attention. And ultimately, when you consider the life of Jesus and then you look at your own, I want you to take a step back and consider the things that you are putting out. Do you also invest your time in spiritual matters in the same way and the same frequency that Jesus does? Or do we often find ourselves lacking in that? One of the problems might be where your input is. A lot of times we hear so much of this world that all we can talk about is this world because that's all that's inside of us. Again, change your input and you change the outcome. That's the simple answer to this, but I want you to think about these conversations that you have. Is God a part of your conversations? When you're out in the world, we all have to go to grocery stores. I mean, they're trying to put them all online, and so maybe soon we won't have to. But for the moment, I mean, I go to the grocery store. When you talk with people, do you insert God into the conversation? Or does that just kind of pass us by because we don't have time to get into it? When you talk with coworkers at work, do you also insert God into the conversation, or is that kind of a secondary thing and I'll get there when I get there, and then that never really happens? When you talk to your parents or your children or your spouse, do you talk about God at all? Or do you assume that they're Christian and so I don't need to discuss this with them? You know, Christianity is broken down into two different ideas. There's evangelism, which is going outside to the world, but there's also edification inside the church. And sometimes, in the midst of going out and preaching towards all of these people who have never heard the Bible before, when I talk to Lauren, I'm only talking about physical things, about how my day is. And I'm never telling her about the things of God. There's a problem with that. There's a preacher I know in Indiana. He's a great man. And any conversation he has, any conversation, doesn't matter what it is, doesn't matter who it's with, be it worldly person or church person, whoever it is, every time the conversation's over, he does the same thing. He gives you a very weak handshake and he says, God bless. You know why he does that? He does it so that God is part of every conversation, even a little bit. Do you know how many people have picked up on that? It's a lot. And that's become his thing. That's how people know him, is he's the guy who says, God bless. Because that's always what he's bringing in. He's always talking about God. It doesn't matter what the conversation was before, he always ends it by saying something about God. Do you think about what you're putting out? Do you think about these seeds that you're planting in people? Do you think about opportunities you're sowing for people that maybe they don't bear fruit yet, but maybe they will in 10 years? Consider your output. Consider the way you represent yourself. Consider the way you show God to the world in the little things that you do, in the little things that you say. At the end of the day, when your energy is all spent and when you're laying tired in your bed at night, you reflect back on the events of the day. Was your energy spent helping others seek God? Christian or non Christian, did you help someone else see the light of God? Or did you do other stuff? Did you get distracted? And did you start following the world instead of following the Lord who made it? Jesus comes by. Two guys in a boat, fishing, trying to do their day's work, and he calls out to them. There's an expectation. You follow me. There's an expectation that you drop everything and you listen to him. You watch him and you emulate him in everything you do and say. It doesn't matter what you put in, it's going to belong to the master. It doesn't matter what you put out, you need to line it up with the master's will because he owns both of them. If you're going to follow me, you're going to follow both of them. That's the call of Jesus. And that's the call to us today. Jesus called Peter and Andrew as they're sitting in a boat. And what's their response? Immediately, they left their nets and followed him. Jesus called James and John as they're sitting with their father. And immediately, they left the boat and their father and followed him. If Jesus were to come to us today, if he were to walk in this building, if he were to walk into your workplace, if he were to walk into your home and he said, "Follow me," would you? Are you really his disciple? These men left their occupation and didn't go back. These men left their father right there. He can work for himself. We need to do the will of God. These men left their comfort zone. They were fishermen, not public speakers. These men left their routine and their traditions and everything that they knew because Jesus came by and asked them, "Follow me," commanded them, "You follow me, and I will change you into something better than you can imagine." If Jesus gave you the same call, would you follow it in the same way? If not, can we really call ourselves disciples? Sometimes I'm afraid many of us, myself included, we're not disciples. We're acquaintances of Christ who see him every now and then. But Jesus calls an all inclusive call. Anyone and everyone who's willing to commit, anyone and everyone who's willing to give up the things that they want to listen to the things of God, you're welcome. You can come to him. You can be his disciple. It's going to take everything you have, but it's going to be so much better in the end. Jesus is calling. We're singing a song about it. And as always, if there's anything you need, whether it's repentance to come back to him or baptism into him in the first place, I'm here to help. I'll be right down here as we're all standing and singing this song.